Hello and welcome to Outland Japan. I'm your host, Peter Carnell, a travel guide based in northern Nagano, and this, as you know, is a podcast that takes you outside the big cities into rural, regional, and the wilds of Japan. And today, we return to Tottori Prefecture for the second half of my interview with Richard Pearce of Sustainable Daisen. Originally from the UK, Richard founded and operates Sustainable Daisen, an NPO dedicated to the protection of the Japanese giant salamander and the effective conservation of its habitat. Richard and I discussed the salamander, the threats it is facing, and the tremendous work he, his wife Kazumi, and others involved with Sustainable Daisen are doing in the first half of the interview. So naturally, if you haven't yet listened to that, pause this and go back and listen now. In this, the second half of our interview, Richard and I enter into a broader chat about the state of environmental and wildlife conservation in Japan and his experience as a foreigner living here, advocating for more effective and sustainable practices that often run counter to government policy and procedure. As such, I think this part of our chat reveals important realities of Japan, including its bureaucracy, its approach to the environment. And these won't be of surprise to anyone living here, but may come as a big surprise to anyone who does not, especially given the often repeated trope of the deep connection and respect Japanese have to nature. Japan is a terrific country. I very much enjoy living here. Richard clearly does too. But like all countries, there are challenges, along with practices and policies that need to change. I admire people like Richard, people who are vocal in a culture you are not meant to be, people who see something is wrong and decide they're going to do something about it themselves. Doing so in your own country takes determination. I think doing it in another country and a very different culture, when you're regularly reminded that you are just a guest, takes real courage. So I say, well done, mate. Keep going. Links to the Sustainable Daisen website and social media are in the show notes, along with a link to the video Richard mentions towards the end of our chat, Bad Boy Monk. The podcast website is outlandjapan.com, and we're on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Search Outland Japan. Now, here's the second half of my chat with Richard. I hope you enjoy. So outside of your work conserving and raising education about the Japanese giant salamander, Sustainable Daisen is involved in other projects, including organic farming and a new push for rewilding in the area you're in. I'm interested, Richard, as someone working in this space, what's your thoughts on the state of conservation in Japan?
How many swear words am I allowed? Basically, like what an important, very important core concept of Sustainable Daisen's mission is that in order to protect any species, you need to protect the habitat. That's really common sense for me, but seemingly that's not the same common sense in Japan. Like I talked to you before about, there's a rule about don't touch the salamanders unless you're licensed, but destroying where it lives and blocking it from breeding is acceptable as long as money's being made. But to put it mildly, Japanese wildlife and nature is being raped. That's a very hard word. I don't normally throw it out there, but it is, and it's terrible. It's depressing, and it seems to be getting worse and not better. Japan is sort of famous for having a deep connection to nature because of Shinto and Buddhism and whatever else. I would argue that connection has been all but severed. And now it's people versus nature. Nature is a thing to be burnt, sprayed with chemicals, killed, bashed.
Controlled
as a way to make money. And money is at the core of it. Famously in the past, there was this thing called Satoyama. Village mountain is the base of meeting. So this kind of edge area where there was a sort of balance between nature and human society. That's gone pretty much. I deal with the Ministry of Environment somewhat. And they say, and most people say, it's a relatively new department and it's toothless, whereas the Ministry of Construction or Concrete or whatever is very powerful, very influential, has a lot of money, has a lot of connections to upper government, and it's just part of this cancerous system that's destroying Japan for the generations to come. We didn't really touch on it before, but I'm a practitioner of Shugendo. So which is Yamabushi, which is a mountain asceticism religion, I guess you can call it, where basically you grow as a person and develop spiritually by doing hardship, pushing yourself within a natural mountain setting. I've been, lucky enough to have been given an honorary monk's name from an important Shugendo temple, and I have a very close relationship with the head priest's family there. So I want to say, I have a deep love and respect for Japanese nature and historical management and how they used to be. But that is really not the case now. And it's devastating for nature, and it's devastating for the future generations of Japan.
I'm so glad you mentioned your practice as a Yamabushi and the tradition of mountain asceticism through Shugendo. It's something we've touched on the podcast before and very, very recently. So hopefully listeners are somewhat familiar with that now. But I want to go back to something you said there, because I think for any foreign resident of Japan listening to you comment on the state of conservation, they won't be surprised. But for anyone who maybe hasn't been here yet or has only been here very briefly, they might be shocked by what you said. But I totally agree with you, because as working as a guide myself, I read a lot of literature and marketing material that references that deep connection of Japanese to nature. I just don't see it, certainly in the contemporary society that we're living in. I also hear it repeated by my guests, so they're consuming this idea. But I have to say, it's not reflective of my experience and the general approach to the environment here. You've already touched on some of the most pressing environmental issues in Japan. Any others that you would identify, just generally speaking?
Like I touched on when I was talking about the threats to Japanese giant salamanders and the river systems in Japan is unsustainable, dangerous farming practices. So one is the chemical part, and organic farming is almost not a thing. And actually, an interesting point was local people told me that they consider organic farming selfish. I'm like, say again. So I heard some waffle about, the seeds and the whatever are going to blow over to my manicured field, which makes no sense because half the fields are now empty, full of weeds, and they're not worried about that, right? But more the fact that normal farming, chemical-rich farming, is the norm, and organic farming is the minority, right? If you are saying organic farming is better, which I don't normally say that, but I believe that, like having less chemicals in your food is preferable if I'm being soft, then you're also sort of casting judgment on what the majority are doing. And in the Japanese cultural system, Confucian-based peer respect system, the nail that stands up will be hit down. And what that means is that any kind of criticism of the majority is wrong, and you will be hit down to shut up. There is some seeds, pun intended, of organic farming being more accepted just because this sort of older generation are getting older and dying out. And it's not their fault. They were told and convinced that the only way to do it is through using chemicals. And JA, the organizations that run farming in Japan, still like, well, if you use our chemicals, we'll give you a tractor loan at 0.1%, that kind of stuff. Do I get that? But more the thing that I've discovered, which is a huge issue, is about animal farming in Japan. And if you would let me, I would really love to speak about that.
Please go ahead. Yep.
I used to eat a lot of meat. Beer and meat, yay, that was my thing. I don't do either these days. And the reason being is not that I don't like the taste of meat or anything like that. It's just animal husbandry in Japan is so cruel that I don't want my money to be keeping that system going.
Again, I think listeners might be surprised to hear you say that. So can you go into a bit of detail?
So one of the things you might notice as a guest or if you live in Japan, you never really see any animals outside. Cows, sheep, pigs, chicken. You just don't see it.
Something guests comment on regularly. Yep.
Right. So where are they? Well, they're inside on concrete in pens. There's this image around the world that Japan looks after their animals, especially cows, feed them beer, give them massages, and play opera to them. Like that, you've probably heard all of those things, right? There may be some cases of that going on, very few, I'm sure. But the reality is they spend their whole lives in small concrete pens, often with their nose through the nose ring tied to a post. So it's battery cow farming. And so, Japanese meat is so marbled. So it's delicious, don't get me wrong, but you don't want to eat a lot of it because it's so fatty. So how can an animal's flesh become so fatty? Well, they're not using their muscles, are they? That's the reality, is that these poor, smart, sentient creatures spend their whole life stood on concrete in a small area, just about, depending on the place, can turn around, but they can't turn around if they're tied to the gate. So that's one thing. That's the kind of the ethical side, which is for me enough for me, a meat lover, to stop eating meat. The second is waste. So a huge problem here, and this is something I'm deeply involved in, and there's sort of reports coming out soon. So if you have so many animals concentrated in a small area, that's a lot of shit. That's a lot of waste, right? And they don't have systems in place to properly deal with it. So what they've been doing is burying it by the thousands of tons straight into the ground, untreated. And this is an area where everyone, even what's called town water, is basically from the ground. It's well water. So even the regional government has pamphlets and things saying, don't do this because it's going to pollute the water system, which makes obvious sense, right? Animal shit is nitrogen, phosphates, etc. And nitrogen being a key one, because once it gets into the water system, it becomes nitrates. When you consume it, it becomes nitrites, and that causes cancer, especially for children and women, but also for men as well. They know what they're doing because I've called them out on it, and I've been in meetings and I've filmed their responses. I've had diggers appear next to my house and I filmed the operator saying, what are you doing? Like, oh, we're going to bury animal shit here. How much? 40 tons. 40 tons how many times? 6 times? So like 250 odd tons of untreated animal shit next to my house, which drains onto my land.
Whose land are they burying it on? Public land?
Well, so there's all sorts of schemes going on. Some local people that own land that live far away, they say, oh, we want to grow crops and we want to bury it because it's fertilizer. So, of course, crops need fertilizer, right? They need, nutrition and whatnot. But there's a line between how much is fertilizer and then how much is industrial waste. And Japan basically doesn't have any rules on that. Even I've heard from the prefecture themselves, over 10,000 tons of untreated shit into the ground. Then they grow canola or what do you call that? Rapeseed oil and corn, which it's for animal feed. But if you look at the proper science, you only need a number of kilograms per that area, and they're putting hundreds of tons. So it's just this scheme that they've had going. As long as it saves money, they don't have a proper system in place. They don't have people who are concerned for the future involved in this, making these decisions. I'm planning to write about this. I've already had experts over from the UK to take water measurements. I've got Japanese guy visiting next week whose company already has technology to deal with this problem cheaply, but is ignored because it's not the construction industry's way. So it's definitely something that I'm going to be announcing to the world, but importantly, announcing to local people, because people are ignorant to this fact.
I'm curious to ask, though, because and I don't think Japan is any different to any other country in this sense. My experience is, as a foreigner in Japan, you're very welcome. until you start to criticize anything.
Yeah.
And I think Australia is the same.
Yeah.
People generally accept foreigners, people who have migrated there, until they start to point out things that aren't so good. The criticism of one thing is often construed or interpreted as a criticism of everything. So as a foreigner, a vocal foreigner working in this space in Japan, imagine obviously at times being critical about the environmental issues that you're seeing. What's the response that you get?
If you live in the UK or Australia or another country, more often than not, you will become a citizen, have a passport, and can vote within a few years. And we
vote. That's the key thing, right?
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And we're not going to say, oh, you're Japanese or you're Indian, you don't have an opinion. No, you're a British citizen because you've got a British passport and that's it. So if you're calling out something that's wrong, like the polluting of the rivers, you will be supported as a good British citizen by most people. Don't have that system in Japan.
Yep.
But basically, like you said, there's this sort of culture, especially for the Westerners, I would say, that you're treated as a kind of like special guest, like a novelty item.
Before you go any further, Richard, can you explain why that is? Why foreigners in Japan, most foreigners don't have the right to vote?
It's very hard to become a citizen in Japan. I don't even know how you go about it.
The critical point being that Japan only recognizes one citizenship. So for you or I to become Japanese citizens, we would have to give up our British or Australian.
Right.
For obvious reasons, most people don't want to do that. So most foreign residents in Japan, they might become permanent residents at some point. That takes time. That gives them no right to vote. So almost all foreigners here will never have the right to vote.
Right.
Anyway, sorry to interrupt you. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. No, that's completely right. And it's the same as if you get married to a Japanese person, have a child, you have to decide which passport they're going to have. Although most people do both and they just keep it secret. Yeah, that's different.
Just very quietly. keep it on the side.
Yeah, so you kind of treat it as this sort of novelty, special guest. But like you said, if you find something that's basically bad, and I'm talking it's bad for Japan, right? So this kind of pollution is bad for the future of Japan. It's bad for the next generations of Japan. And you just go, this is what's going on. This is really dangerous behavior and it's very unsustainable, then the first level of social control kicks in. And that is gossip. Spreading rumors about how, don't trust this person, they break the rules, don't support them, they don't understand. It's not just foreigners that happens to. It's anyone that stands up to the majority, right?
Japanese included. Even worse for Japanese than
foreigners. 100% worse, because I'm not Japanese. I have a deep love for many aspects of Japan, which is why I'm passionate about doing something about it. If you take the nail that stands up will be hit down. So there's a hammer involved in this. So I just think that hammer isn't as effective on foreigners because we don't have that sort of programming from a young age to just automatically shut up.
And I think we're by nature much more conditioned or even enjoy a little bit of conflict.
Perhaps. I mean, and there's good points and bad points to that. I don't want to say that, having been in a society where, the majority and do the best for the group, that it's not all bad. Of course, it's not all bad.
Absolutely not.
But it can be very bad. And that's just speaking the truth about that to protect nature and the health of children in the future shouldn't be such a terrible thing to do. So it happened to me, local groups who are, like I mentioned before, who by name are doing something about Japanese giant salamanders, but aren't actually doing anything. It's just talk. So it's the pretense. And then also if you're then criticizing the government because they're the ones tipping the concrete in and therefore the business and everything else, then they want to shut you down. So the means of control is kind of, like I said, gossip and spreading rumors, and not necessarily rumors, but just saying, oh, terrible, break the rules. It's like, I'm not breaking the rules. I'm just pointing out this is dangerous and we should look at a different way. If you want to do something different, therefore you're calling out the majority or the way the system is working, then you find yourself like in a swamp. It's horrible. And it's hard and it's stressful and upsetting. But once you keep just believing it and if you know you're doing right, and some Japanese people will go out their way to say, really thank you for what you're doing. And that gives you the strength to keep going. And then once you have enough momentum, then it can move forward. That's the thing in Japanese society. You need enough people that minorities catching up the majority, and then things can change.
I know you have some new projects underway with Sustainable Daisen. Could you run me through those? What's on the cards?
Always at the core of what we do is Japanese Giant Salamander conservation. And from the very beginning, the issue of habitat fragmentation caused by the concrete barriers within the river system and has been, a big focus of what we do, what we hoped to do. So I've been working with a really great Japanese giant salamander researcher called Dr. Yuki Taguchi. I call him the Japanese giant salamander whisperer. Recently been doing surveys, and these giants that I'm holding and turning over to check bits and pieces have been so compliant. And that's because he's taught me to understand the behavior of each individual and react accordingly, and just be calm, and then they'll be calm. It's really great. Anyway, we've been doing lots of surveys of a particularly disturbed part of the Nawa River with many weirs in it. And so we've been identifying how many individuals, the sizes and everything else. But we kind of already knew there's a problem, but it's important to have data to present to the government. And I've been to politicians in this area, there's just not enough public interest or money to pay for ramps within the river system, which for me is so annoying and disappointing, because they love concrete and construction. So why can't you just construct a ramp on already a bit of concrete? They just don't want to. And there's no money in it for them. So
it would sound as simple as that.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been proposing for a while, and now I've got Dr. Taguchi agrees, and I think it's a pretty simple but good solution. Is we're going to contact the construction companies that have already done stuff in other prefectures. There are a few cases where bypass ramps have been made up these weirs so the salamanders can move, and ask them for a quote for each weir that we want to bypass. And then once we have that price, we want to find private donors to pay for that ramp. It could be Coca-Cola, it could be KP Nuts, it could be you, Peter. You could say, I'm going to sit in a bathtub of custard for a week. Please sponsor me. Whatever it takes. It could be an English primary school that does a readathon and gets money. Whatever it takes. But basically, we fund and pay for the construction of these ramps because the government will not do it. That's the simple fact. And then all we need to do is, all we need to do, this is probably the most difficult part, is go to the prefectural government and say, this is the problem. This is the data that proves the problem. This is the research that show that building ramps is the way around it. Why would you not do it? But, okay, why would you not do it? It's expensive. Okay, we're going to raise the money. All you need to do is help us cut the red tape. So that's a big plan. That's a really big project. And actually, it's called Project Big. And we're about to launch over the next couple of months, I hope. So I asked the salamander researcher's son when I was visiting, I was like, when you think of giant salamanders, what word do you think of? And he said, big. I'm like, all right, what can I do with that? I was like, all right, that's perfect, actually. Bypass ramp, installation, gift. Because the gift is also important because this almost definitely, I hope I'm proven wrong, most of the support and money is going to be coming from outside of Japan. And certainly up until now, most of the support and the donations which have paid for this research, for me to pay Dr. Taguchi, for us to have, tests done and everything like that, has come from donations from overseas. I just want to make it almost impossible, although I suspect they will at first at least, for the local government to block this plan, because there's no reason why properly they should, other than laziness or some other not good reason. So that's Project Big. So that's on the horizon.
The other project I'm aware that you're kicking off is organic farming.
To normalize organic farming in the area, to encourage people to do organic farming, and to have people to be less fearful of doing organic farming. We need to set an example and encourage. I touched on before that I was able to buy some land up the road from where I live, almost 2 hectares, for really cheap. And I want to use that area as a kind of educational farm. I'm getting rescue animals. I've actually going to pick up 2 rescue pigs soon. I talked about a cow. I want to crowdfund to buy some of these suffering cows from the local farmer who's got them tied to a post their whole life. Just put them in the field and let them be animals. So just walk around, poo, and turn up the ground. So you have 3 or 4 stage farming process where you have livestock, cows or pigs or goats or whatever, and they just live there. They eat the grass. They turn their hooves break up the ground a bit, and they shit in it and add nutrition. And there's also a stage growing crops, but then you also have a stage of rest. So you rotate like that. So you rest the land, you have animals on the land, you grow crops, and you rotate. So obviously the crops in this system are going to be organic, right? So I also want to do, and I'm looking at doing some kind of camping, not exactly glamping. I don't really particularly not fond of that kind of concept, but not so rough, somewhat comfortable camping.
Comfortable camping.
Premium camping, but without...
Who doesn't like being comfortable?
Yeah. Comfortable camping. Let's call it that. That's a good term, isn't it?
I like it.
And it's an amazing place. You've got views of the ocean in one direction, and you've got views of the top of Daisen behind you. It's incredible. But I want to soft educate the people coming about the situation of farming and introduce them to organic farming and why it's something that's preferable. I would love just for them to go, oh, wow, that pig's called Ray or Ronnie. There's a reason for that, but I won't go into it. But, Ronnie's really funny and smart and cute. Ray's like a bit of an idiot, but also funny.
A bit of a joke.
but they've got character. They're sentient, feeling beings. So is the animal that you're going to eat in your, that you buy the meat of in a plastic tray. So I just want to encourage some thought about animal husbandry. I'm not trying to make everyone vegan or vegetarian or whatever, but just to consider the life of the animal before it dies, and make people be aware that if when you buy something, you're voting for that system to remain in place.
And I think important to say, and correct me if I'm wrong in saying this, everything we've spoken about today is not a criticism, say, of Japan itself. The fact that you obviously care and enjoy living in this country, so too myself. And there's many, many things that I'm sure you like about it, and if not love about being here.
100%.
And I can certainly say that for me. And that's one of the reasons I have this podcast, is to promote those things that I think are great. But that doesn't mean that you can't be critical of certain aspects of a country or culture, because every country and culture has things it needs to improve.
100%.
And ultimately, the real test of whether somebody is welcome in that place is that they are allowed to voice an opinion that is critical. And that's the test.
Yeah.
And I think in a country, as you said, there's so many things to like about this country, and the Japanese do think of the community around them before most take action. And that works in so many circumstances. But my observation is the time it doesn't work and it actually quickly falls down is when something is clearly wrong and needs to change. Japanese do not want to typically take the lead and be that voice that stands out.
Exactly. Be that nail that stands out.
A nail that stands out. And that's where foreigners have a real role to play here, because just because the way our cultures operate, I think foreigners are often more ready to take on that role and be the voice that speaks up and put up with the criticism that is then directed their way. So I really admire and respect people like yourself who are doing what you do here, And that's why I was so happy when you said yes to be on the podcast and to give you a platform to speak openly. And thank you for speaking so openly and not being reserved in what you think.
Being reserved is not one of my finest skills. The reason I'm doing what I do is because I love Japan, not because I hate it. And I'm not certainly one of these people who goes, better in Britain, therefore this is what needs to happen in Japan, which is common for people who are here for a couple of years. No, Britain is messed up. You know what I mean? If I was in Britain, I'd be trying to save British wildlife. Don't get me wrong. So I'm not for a second saying that, that's what we need to do. We need to become Britain or the West or whatever. And also a broken system. A big problem of Japan is that it's been resistant to change. And this happened in the Edo period before, and then it all came crumbling down. And then the Americans stepped in, or say the West stepped in, and fed them ideas about how perfect the system capitalism is. And it ain't. And that's crumbling down. And you know what I mean? And they kind of, burn the castles down and stop everything from the past. We need to reset. But it doesn't have to always crumble to rebuild. And that's how I feel Japan is definitely on the decline for various reasons. Japan needs to adapt, and it isn't. And if you speak to young people, they're waiting. They're waiting for this generation to die off. They're waiting for something to happen. But it's going to be too late for a lot of things if you wait. So instead of waiting, start to turn the ship in a different direction. It doesn't have to hit the iceberg full on. It doesn't have to be this way. But young people need to be more engaged, and they need to have some kind of sense that they're part of a bigger project. So that's why I often talk like Japan needs like a 50-year plan, not a 5-year plan, where just to be more sustainable, more in connection with nature.
For anyone who's not been here, will really surprise them to hear you say that, because my impression before I came to Japan, and I get this from a lot of guests, is that Japan does think long term, and they do have these 50-year plans. And when they say this to me when I'm guiding them, I'm like, no.
Simply put, the LDP, the Jiminto, the ruling party in Japan, has been around since post-World War II. And only 4 years has another party been in power. So you imagine the Tories, the Republicans, or whoever, being in power for 70 years uninterrupted. They've been just everyone be wearing sacks and rolling around in pig shit, in my opinion. Apart from a group of very rich lords and ladies, you know what I mean? So it's just that system is, and then I invite people to have a look about how did those people get in power, and it's American influence after World War II. So if you take Kishi, he was the leader of Manchuria during World War II, and then he was on death row, and then he was installed as prime minister, and then his grandson was Abe. So did you know that? Yeah, and Abe said the biggest influence in my life is my grandfather.
Interesting.
So anyway,
that is definitely another episode.
Yeah. So there was a BBC article, and I'll try and find it. It was a guy, the correspondent had been in, I think he was called Rupert Wingfield Hayes, I think. I've forgotten that. He wrote an article when he left Japan, and he sums it up so well. So I really encourage people to find that article.
Rupert Wingfield Hayes.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's okay. Japan was the future, but it's stuck in the past. And that article sums up so much of what's going on. I'm really trying to help protect Japanese nature, because healthy nature is healthy people, happy people. A connection and the connection between nature and people is at the core of everything, I believe. I had some volunteers come from an Australian, and they actually worked in an Australian news company before, and they made a short documentary about me and like the work going on here, and it's called Bad Boy Monk, which is so I was given the honorary title from the head priest of Mitoku-san, one of the top 3 sacred Shugendo temples, called Yan Chabo. So that means bad boy monk, and I've got that tattooed on my arm now.
So the website is Sustainable Daisen. That's DAISEN.org. You also, as we mentioned, have a very nice little Instagram there. So anyone who's interested, make sure to get onto the website, find out about the experiences, the projects you're involved in, and the option to donate if you're interested. So, Richard, again, we've spoken for a long time, but also in advance of today's interview, we've spoken a few times. It's been endlessly interesting, and I hope I can orchestrate a reason to have you back on in future to talk about this and more.
I hope I orchestrate reasons for me to come back on, because that means I'm doing something.
Mate, thank you for your time. And I really, as I said, I mean it quite honestly. I really admire what you're doing there. Yet to meet in person, but hopefully that can happen soon. And good luck with everything that we've discussed. Cheers.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot. Cheers.
And that's it. A big thank you to Richard for making time to speak with me. We really did speak at length on the day of our interview, and also for providing the images used in support of this episode. Sustainable Daisen's website is sustainabledaisen.org. Daisen is spelled Daisen, while you can also find them on Instagram and Facebook by searching Sustainable Daisen. You can find more information on Richard's bushidojapan.com website. That's BUSHIDO Japan.com, including the salamander conservation and viewing experiences he discussed, and his wildlife and conservation tour of Japan, and guided experiences around Mount Daisen. Podcast website is outlandjapan.com, and you'll find us on Facebook, Insta, and YouTube by searching Outland Japan. I'll be back in a week from now with the next episode, after which we fall back into the usual bi-weekly routine. Until then, bye for now.